Alrighty, we're here with Greg Fisher, one of my favorite all-time professors of entrepreneurship from the Kelley School of Business. This is really, really cool, coming full circle. You've actually been mentioned on this podcast before, Greg, with Blake Sorensen from Blake Seedbase back in episode 145. I know you're close with him and advisor to his business. But Greg, so excited to finally have you on. Thank you so much for joining. How you doing today?
Well, it's great to be here. I'm a fan of the podcast, and it's so interesting to be on the other side of the equation.
Yeah, hopefully interesting for the better, not interesting for the worse. You don't have to answer that.
It's always, it would be the same if you saw how the sausage was made behind the curtain of a professor's life.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we're definitely gonna get into that, and we're gonna get into your new book, The Principles of Entrepreneurial Progress, which right at the time of recording is hot off the press. So congrats on that. You're, I'm sure, crazy busy for the launch, and you're making time with us here today. So I really appreciate that. But before we get into the book and some of these key principles of entrepreneurial progress, if I were to make up a term, so your own entrepreneurial experience before you got into teaching entrepreneurship, I know, back in South Africa, you had the business Learninglab, and you grew that, you exited that. Can you share what type of business was and what was the main thing you learned from that experience?
Yeah, so this was a business born out of my MBA. I was an MBA student and sort of had been working at Deloitte, and while in the program sort of learnt about the concept of entrepreneurship and started to question whether that might work for me. And the original conceiving of the idea was to sort of say, could we do something that would create more interesting learning opportunities for people in corporations? I had been in the sort of learning and development division of Deloitte, partly to get away from auditing and accounting. And I saw sort of some of the challenges we had there, and saw that if you applied something of a design thinking lens or a sort of more innovative lens to what was happening in corporate education and corporate training and development, it could generate some interesting results. So we started off along that line, but over time pivoted towards more online delivery, because it was sort of at the time that the internet was proliferating, becoming more accessible to a lot of people. Bandwidth was increasing, so you could do more. And so we sort of got on the early wave of that and started developing or transitioning a lot of our programs into e-learning programs. And so the thing that allowed us to scale was to develop a series of e-learning modules effectively that banks, insurance companies, and auditing firms could white label or license and use, and then pay us a fee for those. And they were mostly orientated towards finances, budgeting, accounting, understanding, sort of analyzing financial statements and stuff, because that was the background that I had come from, and often a piece of sort of training in large corporations that for entry-level or mid-level managers tends to be pretty challenging and can be somewhat boring. And so we try to bring life into it. So the whole notion was to sort of create these modules that could, for the most part, be branded by the organization, and we would just provide the technology and the content and allow them to run these training modules.
So the word that jumped out at me was e-learning, because there's something about that experience that clearly foreshadowed you being a professor. And now you at the time of this recording, you're a professor for grad students as well as through Kelley Direct, the online MBA. So you've taken e-learning to the next level, and I know that's the top ranked online MBA, just an incredible program. So what actually got you to wanting to become a college professor?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I come from a family of teachers, essentially, or on my mom's side of the family, a lot of people have been teachers. When I was graduating high school, had this inclination of wanting to potentially do some kind of teaching, and all through college, I had coached sports to elementary school level students, and had always sort of had this notion that I've got a sort of teaching desire within me. And but because of sort of the career path I'd taken and paying for university and so on, I ended up becoming an auditor or an accountant, the equivalent of a CPA in South Africa. It's called a CA. And I just discovered that wasn't for me. And so I was always looking for ways of getting out of that and back towards what I considered sort of my true calling or identity. And one of the ways to do it was to move into this sort of corporate training space. So I could still be within Deloitte, still sort of serving my time in order to train and develop as an accountant and auditor and get the eventual CA or CPA license. And so drifted towards that, and then because I built up that base of experience, moving into something that was aligned with that made sense from a business standpoint. But there was always still this calling out there to do something that was teaching orientated. And but at this stage, I'd sort of gotten a little bit of the golden handcuffs, where I had started earning relatively well by South African standards and living the life and sort of being somewhat ambitious. And teachers are not paid very well back in South Africa. So if I was to go back to teaching, it would have been sort of like, oh, I'm sort of declaring poverty compared to what I was used to. But then in the process of doing an MBA, I discovered, oh, there's this array of teachers that are very engaged in sort of higher level issues and interact with smart students, and they operate in business schools, because I'd been in a traditional university prior to that, and which didn't really have a business school, that had a commerce department. And so through the MBA, I spent a large portion of my MBA questioning whether I could be one of the people who was teaching in the class. And so even though I started Learninglab, I always had this ambition of sort of moving on from that to try and become a professor. And it happened over time. And it's one of the best decisions I ever made. I absolutely love it. It's a great career on many fronts, and just sort of, I had always been looking for sort of the 7 or 8 years of my career up to that point in time as to what really fit me, my identity, my desire to teach, my desire to sort of interact in the business world, and it just landed up being the sort of perfect recipe.
Yeah, we were trying to put together, if you could be that person in front of the classroom, and I think now it's pretty clear that you can be, and you're an awesome professor. So you turn that dream into reality. But real quick before we move on, obviously I'm biased. I'll say you're biased as well. We're huge fans of the Kelley School of Business. We're huge fans of Indiana University. But I would imagine, growing up in South Africa when you were like 3 years old, it wasn't like, I always want to be a Kelley professor. Like what was it about Kelley and Indiana University that made it a really appealing place and got you to move to probably seemingly middle of nowhere Indiana?
Yeah, so when I first moved to the US, I went to do my PhD at the University of Washington in Seattle. And the reason I landed up there was the dean of the business school where I'd done my MBA had gotten his PhD from there. And as a result of that, I think 2 of the professors in our MBA came from the Foster School, the University of Washington. And so I'd met them, they knew me, I had some kind of connection there. And obviously, coming from South Africa, everyone knows Seattle. They've watched Grey's Anatomy and whatever else.
Is Grey's Anatomy huge in South Africa?
Or Sleepless in Seattle. And so it's sort of, you know where it's positioned. So I knew, yeah, exactly. So I knew where I was going. And I had just gotten married. So my wife, who's also South African, we both moved there. And it was sort of a really interesting time of our lives because we went there and we really didn't know much about the rest of the US. But I've always had this inclination or been intrigued by the concept of a college town. because in South Africa, you don't really get college towns. All the universities are in the big cities. But I had sort of heard about it, try to understand the dynamics of what it would be like to be in a town where the central sort of institution is a university and almost everything centers around that. And I've always quite liked smaller places, places where it's easy to get around. You can get into the outdoors quite easily. It's maybe a little less expensive to live. I grew up in Johannesburg, where to go anywhere is an hour. So you get in the car, you drive for an hour to get absolutely anywhere. And I was sort of trying to get away from that kind of lifestyle. And so as I moved through my PhD program, which takes 4 or 5 years, I started to imagine what life could be, not just from a institution standpoint, but also from a lifestyle standpoint, and try to combine the idea of being able to live this lifestyle, of being able to get into nature quite quickly, being able to get to sports games and interact in an interesting environment, a sort of intellectual environment, but also be in a relatively small town. And so one of my priorities in looking for positions post PhD was I would prefer to be in a college town if such a thing came about. And obviously Bloomington, where Indiana University is, absolutely ticks all those boxes. And then fortunately for me, IU has a really good entrepreneurship program or scholarship. So in the area I'm in, it's seen as one of the sort of elite institutions in terms of producing research, in terms of having programs that students can do. And so it just landed up being a perfect fit. And in essence, when I went on the job market, it was sort of like a dream job that I didn't know whether I could get or not, and I just took a shot at it, and it's worked out really, really well.
It certainly has, and yeah, there's so many great points on Bloomington or B-Town, whatever you want to call it. I always say like it's like the perfect college town. Like when you think of a college town, like I think, and again, biased, but I think of Bloomington because like when you show up there, you're right. It's kind of like, like it's not like a tiny city, but it's not a big city. And it's like a good in between. And, if you drive 5 minutes anyway, it's like farmland. So it's kind of like you feel kind of remote, and the university is such a big part of it. And the campus is just so beautiful. And also just like the town square and Bloomington, Kirkwood Avenue. Like there's so many wonderful parts about it, and there's like 2 high schools. It's like there's families, as there's families that live there as well, in addition to college students and the faculty. So it's just a beautiful place to be. Not to mention a fantastic entrepreneurship program.
Yeah.
So speaking of entrepreneurship, let's get to the principles of entrepreneurial progress. And so again, hot off the press, brand new book. I think. I always think back to the class I took when I was a student of yours. Back, the rare time now that you were teaching undergrad, so I got lucky. But always so many amazing examples and case studies and fun projects and presentations in your class. And so, like, I'm a sucker for anything that you're sharing out, any of your insight, any of your wisdom. But I think this book is super, super exciting. And as part of it, there's 12 principles of entrepreneurial progress. We're not going to go through all of them in order, but I do want to start off by like high level. What is it about like this, kernel or like section of entrepreneurship that got you compelled to write a book on this subject matter?
It's this idea that getting started and making sort of meaningful progress in the early stages of getting started is actually really tough. And part of the reason I see that is because, we got a lot of students, whether it's MBAs or undergrads, who have entrepreneurial ambition while they're here, they come up with an idea and really can land up spinning their wheels quite a lot during that time. And so I've seen it time and time again. It's like a cycle. Someone arrives at your office. They think they've got something that they want to do, an idea for an app, a notion for a new retail concept, or whatever it might be. And it's sort of like, what advice, concrete advice, can I give them that would really move the needle and make a difference? And what, from our research standpoint, can we point to that might really help? What pragmatically is simple enough to sort of act on that I could offer that would be valuable or useful? And I've always sort of been somewhat frustrated by entrepreneurship because it's sort of put out there as this complex, difficult thing to achieve. And no one's, I don't think, tried to distill it down to sort of its fundamentals. Or I think there's some sort of recipes for entrepreneurship that are very useful, but they're sort of directed towards a type of business or a particular setting. But I wanted to go even more fundamental than that to sort of say, what are the core kernels of of advice or input that can really make a difference when someone's trying to get started with a business idea and trying to move it from the point of having the idea or having a notion that they want to do something to having something that's somewhat fundable or that external investors might be interested in if that's the direction they want to go. If it's not the direction they want to go, then something that's starting to really get momentum and be sustainable. So it's that early phase of the business that I think having concrete things that you can act on can make a real difference. And then the second piece of that is part of my role as a professor is we do a lot of research. And the field as a whole does a lot of research, but a lot of that's getting stuck back in academic journals, and it might reach a few people through class sessions or other things, but it's not being translated into things that are really accessible to the general public who want to start a business. Sometimes it comes through in maybe a magazine article or something, but trying to take what we've understood from a research standpoint and make it translated so that it's really useful to others, I think is an important endeavor. And so it's a combination of those things that sort of prompted me to want to put this book together.
Well, I think that's a sign of a great professor and a great teacher in general, is like simplifying things. Like you hear about people talking about, trying to get their marketing message across, and it's like people always use the example of like, all right, well, like explain it. Like, how would you explain this to like a second grader, for example? Shout out my wife Dana, teaches second grade. But so I think it's a really good principle, pardon my use of your word, to focus around. And yeah, that early phase of entrepreneurship is just so fascinating, and that's part of like why I became why I became interested in entrepreneurship and started this podcast in the first place, is like that journey from idea to real business in itself. Like not even thinking about like growing the business yet, but just like starting it and turning into a real like stable business is just so fascinating. And that's, like the lifeblood of how this industry, the industry of entrepreneurs, if you call it, flourishes. So what, on that note of like that early phase, what's something that you see with like your students or businesses you're advising that many new entrepreneurs run into in like those early days of starting a business that they really didn't expect, kind of caught them off guard?
I mean, I think one of the things, just very explicitly building on what you've just said, is that they try and overcomplicate things too early. So principle number one is the problem principle: identify a problem that's really worth solving. And many people get that right. Some people make a mistake of just sort of saying it would be nice to have this, or I thought I want this. But really getting down to the problem that you're trying to solve is the foundational starting point. So who's got that problem? Why have they got that problem? How often do they experience it? What are the emotions or the frustrations that they endure when they experience it? So that can quite easily be met and solved. But then as you start to think about solutions to that problem and how you might build a business out of them, people want to typically overcomplicate things very, very quickly. So they think of a super app with a whole lot of features and it's going to change the world. And
I don't know, a super app sounds pretty cool.
It does sound cool, but it's very hard to act on. And so principle number 3 is the simplicity principle, is get it down to its absolute core of what you're doing. Like, in order to solve that problem, what's the simplest way that you can solve that problem in a way that's going to be meaningful to others? And it's often leveraging existing technology, utilizing resources that you've got, conveying the idea as you've just described in the simplest way possible. So one of the big mistakes I see people make is, in order to try and impress the outside world or impress their rich uncle or their professor or their friends, is they overcomplicate what they're trying to do instead of trying to keep it as simple as possible. Because keeping it simple allows you to take action, allows you to make progress, allows you to test out whether the core of the idea can actually work. So that's certainly one of the things that I see.
Simplicity, how does that work for an entrepreneur? Like, how do you apply that to your business, simplicity?
Well, I think it's about number one, what is the problem we're trying to solve and how can we solve that as simply as possible? And when I say simply, I mean, strip out anything that's just nice to have and say, what's core to solving this problem? So I use the simple acronym, the word simple, as an acronym in order to convey the simplicity principle. And the S stands for subtracting anything that's not necessary to solve the problem. The I stands for imitating what others have done, because often people have solved pieces of the problem, or there's a technology that you can just plug in to do something. There's no need to reinvent the wheel in what you're doing. And then I keep going through that, like the L stands for leveraging resources that are under your control because you've already got access to them and you can take action. And the E stands for explaining this thing in as simple terms as possible, or getting, and so I use that as a means to convey what are the things you need to work on in your business in order to simplify it. The P stands for eradicating or taking out any extraneous pieces of your portfolio, of your product portfolio. So those are the concrete things that I'm suggesting around simplicity. And there's actually really good empirical research to support this idea of subtracting, of eliminating, of taking things away to make things better. And I build on that research to make the arguments around simplicity in order to convey this as a core tenet of making progress as you go forward with the business.
That's an incredible acronym, and also you made this very challenging on yourself to remember all the acronyms and all the principles.
Well, I was thinking I could sort of dive into the book and try and find where it is. And in fact, I think I might have just seen the page. So the S is subtract elements that aren't needed. The I is imitate others. The M is minimize features. So the P is prune products in your portfolio. The L is leverage resources, and the E is edit explanations. So that's the acronym for sure. But I would need the book to remember it.
Well, there's going to be a test at the end of this interview, Greg, where we go through those again. No. All right. So some of the examples you talked about so far are the principles. There's the problem. There's basically keep it simple, stupid, in the simple acronym there. I guess there's a lot of acronyms around simple. That's great. But what are some what's another one, maybe like one of the later principles? Like what's another one that's kind of like a different area that's another good thing to think about as you're starting or building a business?
So just to step back, the way I organize the principles is, as you pointed out earlier, there's 12 of them. And the first 6 are focused on early value creation. So I put them in a value bucket. They're the practical things you can do to begin to create value around a new idea or a new business. And so those are the first 6. And then there's, and the value bucket almost like stretches across the top. And then there's 3 other types of principles, each with 2 elements to them that contribute to creating value. And so there's a resource bucket, or how do you think about resources, resourcing, which might include financing, it might include getting people on board, it might include other things. There's a action bucket. So what are some of the fundamental actions you can take? And then there's what I call the big picture bucket, which is about tying things together. So those 3 buckets sort of support the value principles. And so, for example, one of them in the action bucket is what we call the hustle principle. And some of the research that I've done and published is around this construct of entrepreneurial hustle, which really seems to make a difference. And now it's different from the sort of hustle culture that we often see out in the world. It's about.
I was going to say that's something that how I feel like over the past decade it has become almost like a negative thing if like you're hustling too hard or it's like you're like a hustle bro. But you're saying it in a different light.
So in the context of getting something started, the way we defined it and where this was derived from was we did this deep dive and analysis of all of the podcast interviews with entrepreneurs from the How I Built This podcast. And we had taken the very first 48 of them and analyzed them for themes, for actions, for everything, and eventually derived this idea of entrepreneurial hustle being a necessary but not sufficient condition for success. So if you don't have it, it's going to be really hard to move forward. If you do have it, it doesn't assure you of being successful. But we defined it as sort of being dependent on 2 key dimensions. And the one is acting with urgency, that you as the entrepreneur need to bring the energy that there's something that needs to be done here. And often entrepreneurs are invoking sort of some kind of time restriction on themselves or their early employees to make sure they're getting things done and action is happening, as opposed to just talking about it, thinking about it, creating Excel spreadsheets. And then the second piece of hustle was that often that urgency is coupled with some kind of unorthodoxy. You're not just doing things the way they've always been done. You're willing to skirt around and do things slightly different from what they've been done in the past. And when you combine urgency and unorthodoxy, you get this sort of notion of hustle. And some of the examples we referred to back in the research and I bring up in the book are Sarah Blakely when she's founding Spanx. Her prototype is literally just cutting off the feet of traditional pantyhose, and that's what she uses. And then when she's trying to sell it into Neiman Marcus, she, instead of just doing the traditional sales presentation, she realizes she's losing the buyer, and she says, "Come with me to the change room, to the fitting room, to the stalls," and sort of shows what her clothes look like without this new underwear, and then what it looks like with it. And so willing to do these things with a sense of urgency and a sense of unorthodoxy that really moves the needle. And so we go quite deep into the concept of hustle and why it's important in these early stages of a business, because it allows you to get things done, to start to show progress. And that's what brings other people on board. And that's what allows you to sort of have something to show for your efforts.
That's a wonderful equation there. Urgency plus unorthodoxy equals hustle.
Yeah.
And shout out Sarah Blakely. She's
and so
out of this world inspiring.
Yeah. And the thing we put in there, so I literally write it up like an equation in the, I've got.
Get out your calculator.
Yeah. I've got action, but then urgency and unorthodoxy in the parentheses, multiplied next to each other in the parentheses next to the action. So you need to take action, but part of turning action into hustle is to layer in some urgency and some unorthodoxy with that.
So I'm especially fascinated by that urgency piece. Is that something, in your opinion and in your research, like, is that something that's innate for certain entrepreneurs, or is that something that can be learned?
Well, I actually think, I don't even know if it's about learning it. I think it's about recognizing that invoking urgency is valuable for oneself and is valuable for other people who you're trying to bring on board. So the minute I started to study hustle, I started to say, okay, well, let me test myself whether I can try and get more done in a day by trying to say, okay, well, I'm giving myself a deadline of a day to write this introduction to a paper or to prepare this set of slides, or I'm only going to give myself the morning to do this. And the minute I invoke that urgency, I start to see myself operating in a slightly different way. I can get more done, and it sort of like prompts me to think about the problem slightly differently. And so I think it's not even necessarily that you need to learn it. You just need to recognize it and begin to practice it. And then you start to see the value it creates. The person, so one of the, and I know he's a controversial figure, but one of the people who really uses urgency to the max is Elon Musk in his businesses. If you read through the book called Liftoff by Eric Berger about the founding of SpaceX, condensed time and creating a sense of urgency is like one of his superpowers. And so what he's always doing with his team is he's saying, NASA does this in 6 months, we're going to do it in 1. NASA took 3 years to get this thing approved, we're going to take 3 months. And he like radically condenses time as his expectations around how much they're going to get done within time. And that transforms the way they think about the problems, the way they tackle the problems, and the output that comes from those efforts. And so that's just one of the really salient outlier examples of the sense of urgency.
Well, we've come totally full circle now, because when I was in your class, over 10 years ago at the time of this recording, we did a project. The topic we chose for our presentation was about Elon Musk, and at the time, which I'm sure they're still doing, scaling the Tesla supercharger, those charging stations, because at the time they were within 100 miles, maybe 50 miles of supposedly everywhere in the US, and now I'm sure they're even more so. But it's funny you brought up Musk, because we literally studied him 10 years ago. But that urgency, that hustle, I think is so important. So I'm not going to make you recite all of them, but there's so many amazing principles of entrepreneurial progress in your book, and you just have a knack for translating that sort of in the weeds research to something that's digestible and so many entrepreneurs can learn from. Overall, high level, if you are an entrepreneur and you're feeling kind of stuck, you need some help getting some momentum and moving forward with your business, what's just kind of a good high level, philosophy, if you will, that will help you unlock things and maybe bring your business to the next level?
So one of the things I like to encourage entrepreneurs to think about is, what can I do in the next day, in the next week, and in the next month that's going to move me forward in a meaningful way? And think about it at those 3 gradients of time. What can I do today that's actually going to be meaningful? What can I do? Because that's really saying, and I call the response to these in the book micro bursts of progress. You're looking for these little injections of things you can do that are going to be somewhat meaningful. And so what can you do what can I do today? Who can I call? What can I build? What tests can I run? So what can I actually do today? What can I do in the next week? That's sort of a slightly different time frame, but it's still forcing you to think about the near term. And then what could I do over the next month? And to almost, if you're stuck, step back, go and get a cup of coffee or whatever you prefer, and go and brainstorm and almost write yourself down. Next day, next week, next month, what you can do in those times that is going to meaningfully move things forward. And then these principles are designed to sort of be anchors for what might be meaningful actions during that time, those gradients of time. Like if you're really stuck, go back to the problem that you're trying to solve and say, what is this problem? Let me really try and get deeper into it. And what are some easy solutions for it? But it's sort of like, okay, well, as I'm thinking about what I can do in those time frames, let me go back to the principles and see which of them feel right to act on or to engage with in each of those time frames. So, do I need to do more exploration? That's our second principle. Or do I need to build a prototype? That's our fourth principle. Or do I need to run a test or an experiment? That's our fifth principle. Do I need to better tell the story of what I'm doing? That's one of our principles. Do I need to step back and think about this thing, how this thing comes together in its business model? That's one of our principles. So, the principles sort of go from some very micro and very specific to slightly bigger and more complex as you evolve through them. But the idea is that you can actually take action in response to any of these principles in those kinds of time frames.
Well, speaking of timing and time frames, it is time for the moment you've been dreading, I'm sure. Let's time to wrap up with some rapid fire Q&A. You ready for it?
Yeah, sure.
All right, let's get wild. What is your pitch to get anybody to become a fan of cycling or bike riding? Because I know you are.
An activity that you can do as long as you live that's going to get your heart rate up but not break your knees.
That's perfect, yeah. Because there's a lot of benefits of running, but yeah, it can wear on you over time. So that's great. All right, what is the biggest difference you've noticed over the past decade in teaching undergrad students versus graduate students?
Undergrad students, lots of energy, not a lot of experience to anchor back on. So you've got to sort of bring the experience into the class.
I certainly was guilty of that.
Graduate students think they know it all, and you've got to sort of bring them back to size, and very worried about getting a job.
Oh, yeah, fun. So it's kind of like a happy medium there that you got to bring people towards. All right, and then how about an extra wrinkle to that? Now you're doing a lot of online teaching as well. What's, besides the obvious logistics-wise, like what's the biggest change that you've needed to make as a professor of, online MBA versus traditional MBA?
One of the things is just really understanding or distilling what's appropriate to be delivered in an asynchronous fashion without me needing to be there, and where's the real value that comes from interaction with the professor. So you sort of split, because there's less face time and you're splitting your time apart. And I've had to really say, where's my value that as a person interacting with the students, where's that coming from? And what can I shift into video, shift into audio format, shift into other formats that they can digest in their own time?
All right. And then besides it taking over an hour to go anywhere, which I'm sure is up there, what's the biggest thing you actually miss about Johannesburg?
So Johannesburg, or South Africa more generally, is a place where you can just get stuff done. So if you go back to us referring to hustle, it's
I was going to say, it sounds like a great place for entrepreneurs.
Well, it is and it isn't, because there's not a lot of funding and not a lot of, it's difficult to access external resources. But in terms of making things happen, there's always, there's a term in Afrikaans, which is one of the other languages in South Africa, which says, "A boer maak 'n plan," which is a farmer makes a plan. And it's sort of like the ethos or essence of how South Africans think, is there's always a way to solve a problem. And so I often miss in the South African culture, if you're trying to do something, it's always, okay, well, we could do this, and then we do this, and then we do this. In the US culture, it's often, well, we can't do it because there's this rule or there's this problem, or no one's done it like that in the past. So it's that kind of mentality that I sometimes miss.
Oh, that's really interesting. All right, well, we're gonna make you feel at home again in the USA. What was like the moment that you lived in the USA long enough that you were like, this is home now? Obviously, it will never be your original home, but still.
That's a great question. So I've had a few moments. I remember a moment probably around the time I was teaching you. So I'd been at IU for about
it was when I walked into the classroom and you're like, this kid's awesome.
No, it was I might have been coming to your class, but it was walking across that bridge at the Kelley School of Business. So for those who don't know, the Kelley School it's got a road that runs right through it, and a bridge that goes over that road, where if you're going to one side, you've got to go across the bridge to get to the other side, and so on. And there's often quite nice views from there. So I was walking across the bridge at the Kelley School of Business. It was probably about 7:30 or 8 in the morning. It was early. The sun was coming up, and I was carrying my briefcase, walking there, dressed up to go to class. And I was like, wow, this is the life I wanted to live. When all those years when I was thinking back to being a teacher, to wanting to get into a business school, I was going off to teach, and I was like, this is it. I've arrived. I've done it. And so that was one moment. And then last year or the year before, no, it would have been the year before last, we got citizenship. So that's how long it takes. So,
Wow.
I'd lived here for 15
crazy.
or 16 years and eventually got citizenship. And just that whole process of recognizing, now I'm actually accepted. So I still hold on strongly to my South African identity, but I do value the opportunity that the US has given me.
That's all. I have chills. And shout out Fee Lane, a wonderful street.
Yep.
But so last one, in the spirit of Bloomington, what is the most underrated restaurant in Bloomington?
The most underrated restaurant in Bloomington.
Like your hidden gem, which we won't tell anybody about. Wink, wink.
Well, for food, in terms of quality of food, for me, it's Upland Brewery. So it's
great place.
Upland often get known for their beers and in particular for their sours. But the thing that they do really well is just make the absolute, in my opinion, best burger in town. So there's a burger they make called the Plum Burger, and it's actually got like plum jam on it and somewhere in there, and a whole lot of other things. High quality meat. And it's one of the places that's, interestingly enough, open on a Sunday night. Bloomington sort of shuts down on a Sunday, but I love going out on a Sunday night, sort of thinking about the week ahead, chatting about the weekend that's just been. And so and on a good night, you can sit outside and on the balcony, on the veranda. We can take our dog. And so it's just got a special place in my heart.
That is a special place. Yeah, I spent many times there in Bloomington. I don't know if they still have it, but the first time I heard about Upland was my Aunt Mindy. She had a sandwich there called the Three Little Pigs. It was like 3 different types of pork or ham or something like that. And it was just a really, really good sandwich. But yeah, their burgers are always amazing too. And then I think it's them also that created the, for football this year, and I guess basketball as well, the candy stripe can.
Yep. So
with candy stripes on.
You see that everywhere now. So I was lucky enough to go to a lot of the football games this year because IU was on the up.
Yeah.
And that's just become sort of part of the sort of visual of being at Memorial Stadium, is you seeing those whatever they've called it, Hoosier Lager or whatever it is.
Yeah. It just looks like the best beer can in the world. Well, Greg, thank you so much. Really appreciate all you're doing, and obviously, inspired me over 10 years ago, and so this is really cool coming full circle. Thank you so much for coming on and for all you do to inspire and help out aspiring entrepreneurs out there. Where is the best place if people want to grab a copy of your book? Where's the best place for that? And then if they just want to, learn more, connect with you online.
So the book is available on Amazon. If you just search for the Principles of Entrepreneurial Progress, it's there now, and you can buy a hard copy or soft copy or a Kindle version. All the the publisher is Oxford University Press, so OUP, if you just search for that, another place to buy it. And then the easiest way to connect with me is I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. I actually send out a daily mini newsletter on LinkedIn focused on entrepreneurship and strategy topics. And that's sort of my go-to place. And part of the reason is a lot of our past students are active on LinkedIn and they use it to get jobs and then stay there. So it's the way I stay in touch with prior students and various things. And so, if you just search for me on LinkedIn or LinkedIn.com, Greg C. Fisher is basically what my the URL is. So either of those two things are probably the best to get the book or the best to stay connected with me.
Perfect. And I should say, Greg is one of my favorite names in the world because it's also my dad's name. So very familiar with Greg going back. So great.
Well, if I'd had a son, I would have called him Max. So
perfect. You're gonna bring a tear to my eye. All right, Greg. Last thing, final thoughts. It could just be a quote or words to live by. Just a few final words of entrepreneurial advice. Send us home here.
Well, I've got next to me in my office a sign that says "Get it done," but then in front of the "it" is an SH that's sort of slightly grayed out, and I think that's part of what entails being an entrepreneur is getting it done, and that often means getting shit done.
Bring on the